good afternoon and welcome to another Nesta Talks 2, our series where we look beyond our existing boundaries and think bigger thoughts, interesting thoughts with brilliant thinkers from around the world who want to provoke us, give us an insight into some of the themes and trends of the future or into their detailed work, so we gain new perspectives on our experiences. If you don't know Nesta, we are the UK's innovation foundation focused on making change for social good in 3 different areas, thinking about a healthy life, a fairer start for young people, and about a sustainable future. And my name is Vicky Selleck. I'm our Chief Partnership Officer, looking after the enterprises and different ventures that Nesta sets up as part of achieving those 3 missions. Nesta's worked in cities and thinking about future cities, healthy cities, for a long time, really, probably for the last 10 or 15 years. We've got a real keen interest in health, in particular how that affects populations, including an aging population or an immigrant population, or people who are facing multiple comorbidities, etc. We've got a real interest in data, how you can use data analytics to predict things that are happening in cities, but also how cities can use data and smart technology to know what's happening and to be able to operate more efficiently. And we've got an interest in the cities of the future, how drones might operate, for example, or how cities might regulate new technologies in the cities of the future we can't even quite imagine yet. We brought some of that work together, thinking about 20 tools for how a government can innovate, how government, whether that's public officials or the private sector, the voluntary sector and the public sector working together. But we're always interested in new thoughts, and I'm delighted today that we're joined by 2 of the world's preeminent economic professors who think about cities full time. They are both from Harvard. So I'm joined by David Cutler, who's a Harvard professor in economics and also a real health expert, having advised the Obama campaign over many years, and also Ed Glaeser, who's a Harvard professor in urban economics specifically, and a real local government expert. We're going to be tapping into their thoughts in a moment, thinking particularly about healthy cities and whether a healthy city is essential for prosperity. Feels particularly relevant today in the UK as government announces more measures to deal with rising numbers in the COVID pandemic. But we also want to think about a wider sense of health, about well-being, about really, healthy growing up, healthy aging, how you tackle inequalities in cities, and think really about whether or not you can get the benefits of city living, those innovations in productivity, in sort of improvements in economic circumstances without some of the disadvantages. So we're going to explore some of those topics today. I'm delighted that both of you can join us. Thank you for zooming in from across the waters. David, are we turning to you first? Would you like to introduce?
We'll start with Ed first, and I'll come out.
And then David can cut me off. It's great to be here, Vicky. Thank you. Whenever I would give a talk of this nature, let's say in 2019 or earlier, I would always start with a figure like this one. No, it doesn't. Need to escape this for 1 second. Let's see here. Having slight technical issues. This was working. I would start with a figure like this one. Okay. Hopefully the new figure has come up. No, it's still got the... okay. It's sort of happening, but happening a little bit slowly. Let's figure like this one. What this has shown, and we have some sort of an issue in the image here. Vicky, is the image coming? Okay. All right. Now it's coming clearly. Okay. An image like this one. So what I've done here is I've taken the 1,114 NUTS 3 regions in Europe. This is old Europe, so it would have included the UK as well. And I've ordered them on the basis of their density level, because at their hearts, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. The blue line shows the relationship between GDP per capita and density. The densest tenth of these regions have incomes that are twice as high than the least dense half of these regions, right? This is something economists call agglomeration economies. The fact that we become more productive when we are enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity, in which we can learn, in which we can buy, we can sell, we can work together. We can benefit from being in an amazing city like London, or Manchester, or Birmingham, or Edinburgh, or Glasgow. The red line shows a fact which is slightly more surprising, which is the relationship between population change and initial population density levels. So whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we were clustering in. Now, that relatively triumphant view of cities really did characterize a lot of the sort of post-industrial era. And then all of a sudden, this happened. A return to the oldest of the demons that come with density. And there are many downsides to urban density, including traffic congestion, high housing costs, sometimes crime. But by far the worst of these is contagion. The first really well-documented example of an urban plague that we know of is the plague of Athens, which hit that city in 430 BCE. If you think of the backstory for the plague of Athens, 5th century Athens was really doing all that you could possibly hope a city to do. It was connecting genius. It was enabling breakthroughs in drama, in architecture, in sculpture, democracy itself. The field of history was born in the figures of Herodotus and Thucydides. Now, all that success, economic and military, as well as cultural, then excited the rivalry of Athens' military, rural counterpart of Sparta. The leader of the Athenian democracy, Pericles, when challenged by Sparta, refuses to back down, and so the Peloponnesian War was on. Pericles' plan is to bring the Athenians behind the walls of the city, trusting in the walls to keep out the Spartan warriors, the hoplites, and then send forth the superior Athenian fleet to harass the shores of the Peloponnesian mainland. Perfectly sensible militarily, but a bacteria or virus can enter in behind walls that would keep out an enemy warrior. And cities are the nodes on our global lattice of travel, transport, and trade. And so they are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for viruses. And that's exactly what happened. Some kind of plague ran through Athens in 430. About a quarter of the city's population dead in 2 years. Thucydides, who was there, describes a city that has gone amok, in which people live only for the day because they do not expect to see tomorrow. Now, this doesn't completely destroy Athens. The city soldiers on for another quarter century fighting Sparta. But in a sense, its glory is gone. And it never again reaches the heights that it would before 430 BC. In a sense, one of the key points of this is the impact of plagues, like all natural disasters, is mediated by the strength of civil society when it strikes. When plague would come again during the era of the 5 good emperors that Gibbon described as the happiest moment in the history of mankind, the plague did relatively little, right? Because the society was strong and united behind solid leadership. 5th century Athens, they were already at war, and so it was much more destabilizing. Even more catastrophic were the events of the 4th century CE and the 5th and the 6th century CE, when the plague of Cyprian and the plague of Justinian really first rocked the Western Roman Empire and then plunged Europe into centuries of darkness because the situation was already destabilized. Now, for much of the past 200 years, our cities have been relatively protected against pandemic. We certainly had plenty of them in the 19th century, which was an early age of globalization. And so diseases like yellow fever, which comes out of Africa, it's a mosquito-borne illness. It works its way over to the cities of America's northeast in the late 18th century and then or early in the 19th century. The death rates from yellow fever are something like 10 times that higher than COVID-19. And then, of course, the great killer of urbanites, cholera, which emerges out of the Ganges Delta in 1817. It gets carried along by the British Army. It gets carried along by the Russian Army, then makes its way to London, to Paris, to New York after 1830. Again, sometimes the death rates could be as much as 20 times higher than COVID. But despite those deaths, people continue to come to cities. One reason for that is that cities were able to protect themselves. They did so by learning. Think about Dr. John Snow, who used his famous ghost map showing the pattern of deaths in the 1854 cholera outbreak, and figuring out that cholera was being spread by water, by a particular water pump. Think about the investments in infrastructure, which were incredibly expensive but incredibly valuable. The American cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as our national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. It required people in cities coming together and really making investments that would change things. And those investments are, in a sense, we at least argue in our book, that they are a hinge of history, where governments move from being really exclusively agents of deaths, which they pretty much was all they did prior to 1815, to becoming agents of life as well, who saved people through the use of this water-related infrastructure. Now, we've had a blessed century, free from urban pandemic, and then all of a sudden COVID struck. This shows the map of death rates as of April 30, 2020 in the US. Again, highly urban plague in the early years because it comes in to the US through New York. It gets spread to Boston by a biotech conference. It gets spread by partiers in New Orleans. It gets spread to Detroit and Atlanta in the early days. It hits the cities first. It also spreads more easily in the informal settlements of the developing world. This is, again, an early period COVID spread. This is the share of the population living in slums and the prevalence of the disease in India. The remarkable serological work of Anup Malani finds that by July 2020, so a year and a half ago, more than 50% of the residents of some Mumbai slums had already been infected by COVID-19. They didn't die all that much because they didn't have the comorbidities like obesity. They're much more prevalent in the wealthy world, and they tended to be young. But of course, an airborne pandemic, unlike, for example, cholera, which you can protect yourself by really separating yourself from the waste of other human beings, an airborne pandemic like influenza or like COVID-19 can spread everywhere. And by November 2020, it had gone to the Dakotas as being its high point. So it really isn't density that makes the difference for the long run rates. And it certainly wasn't density within cities. This shows the 5 boroughs of New York City. And what you can see is the slender sliver, this white area, that's Manhattan. That has the tallest buildings. This is Brooklyn Heights. This is also tall. Those were the areas, and this is as of June 2020, that had the lowest COVID case rates. It was the outlying areas, the lowest density areas that had the highest COVID case rates. Why? Because dense buildings didn't spread the disease. Behavior spread the disease. Mobility spread the disease. And indeed, this shows the change in mobility, just people leaving the house, that we're told by cell phone data, by the Safecraft cell phone data. And what you should be able to see, we're not seeing this come up here. Let's what you should be able, there we go. What you should be able to see is that the places that had the sharpest reductions in mobility were the ones that had the sharpest reductions in cases, which is really telling you that, on average, a 10% reduction in mobility during these early months was associated with a 20% reduction in cases. Now, why did they reduce their mobility in the city center and not on the edges? It wasn't because they were smarter. It was because they were luckier. It was because they were in jobs that, knowledge sector jobs that enabled teleworking, and they weren't in essential industries like working in grocery stores or pharmacies. And one of the implications of that is that this pandemic was a wildly unequal event. It was an event that took away the livelihood of poor people more than rich people, and it was an event that killed poor people. In fact, somewhat remarkable fact is in the US, mortality of wealthy people didn't really go up at all in 2020 relative to 2019. It was only the mortality of the poor that soared. One of the reasons for the poor's economic vulnerability during the pandemic has been the evolution of work. If you go back to the 14th century Black Death, right, which kills perhaps a third of Europe's population, those who remained were wealthier because it was a world of subsistence agriculture where wages and wealth are determined by the amount of land relative to the number of people. And the number of people declines by a third. The land per capita increases by 50%. And so the increasing wealth that followed the Black Death may have indeed generated the demand for urban luxury goods that then gave us the urban renaissance of the 15th century. Flash forward to 1918, 1919, to the industrial economy. Thanks to the work of Francois Velde, we've got remarkable fine-tuned data on this. It was a short, sharp recession. Mines shut down, sometimes even factories shut down because of influenza, but they came back quickly because people didn't stop buying durable goods because of that pandemic or because of this pandemic. People still bought cars and ice boxes, and so the demand remained. But over the past century, automation and outsourcing have eliminated those factory jobs. But the ability to serve a latte with a smile has been an employment safe haven in an era of large-scale factories and robots. Yet those jobs can vanish in a heartbeat when those smiles become a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And so that leads us to this question, right, of, will we ever go back to the office, which is incredibly important for those urban service sector jobs, because they're not going to, continue if people aren't coming into the city. And indeed, the future of Britain is tied to the future of London, and a London that is emptied out in perpetuity is a very scary prospect for the nation. This shows us that at least as of November, we still have a remarkably large amount of vacancies in our high-end office towers in the US. Castle Technologies are sort of a fancy technology that does key swipes. And many people have thought that this Zoom revolution is just going to mean that offices are over. Now, I'm pretty skeptical. I'm skeptical because it's been 40 years since Alvin Toffler declared that, information technology was going to make face-to-face contact in the cities and enable that contact obsolete. And for most of the past 40 years, he's been completely and totally wrong. The primary reason for that is that what information technology and globalization have done is that they've increased the returns to being smart. They've increased the returns to innovation. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. And so a knowledge-intensive world is a world in which cities fare well, not a world in which cities fare poorly. You can see a version of this in this paper, which actually refers to this. This was done just during the pandemic, although the data is pre-pandemic. We now have, it's one of two studies that looks at the impact of sending call center workers remote. What you see in the short run is their productivity is unchanged. Okay, but in the long run, and you can see this is these two lines, the bottom red and blue ones, the blue line is on-site, the red line is remote. Your probability of being promoted drops by 1/2 if you're remote. Both studies show the same thing. Why? Well, I think a reasonable view is that, being promoted to an upper level call center worker means that you've learned how to handle difficult calls and that your boss has learned that you're good at handling difficult calls. How could that happen when you're just at home? Where would you pick up that knowledge? A related piece of information, this comes from work on Microsoft programmers, I'll just read it to you. Our results show that firm-wide remote work caused the collaboration network of workers to become more static and siloed, with fewer bridges between disparate parts. Furthermore, there was a decrease in synchronous communication and an increase in asynchronous communication. Together, these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the network. Face-to-face contact is a machine for learning. Right? It's much harder to teach new students when you're remote. And the value of learning has only gone up. The complexity of the world has only increased. And we have evolved over millions of years to have these cues for communicating comprehension and confusion that are often lost when we're not in the same room with one another. This is one reason why, in fact, firms have stopped hiring workers that are remote. So this slide, which will eventually come up, over on the left-hand side, we see non-remotable jobs, which had a sharp decline in both employment and new hiring at the start of the pandemic, but they came back. The right-hand side shows remotable jobs that could be done via Zoom. Employment stayed steady, new hiring plummeted. So even though Microsoft told us its programmers were still programming perfectly well, overall new hires for programmers dropped by 40% between the start of 2020 and the end of 2020 because companies feared to start new relationships. We've had a long literature now on remote learning in the schools, right, which shows a similar problem. To a first-order approximation, remote learning for school-age children is completely useless. Finally, a final reason why I really hope that the future is not remote is that will be a future that's even more unequal than the past. This just shows the pattern of remote working as of May 2020. 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely. 5% of Americans who were high school dropouts were working remotely, right? This is not a technology that works for most ordinary people. What do we actually know on this from Google Workplace? Well, the best number we have is this is just trips to the city, trips to the office, going to the workplace. We think it's still down by about 30% relative to pre-pandemic. Now, even though I believe that the demand for face-to-face contact will bring offices back and will bring cities back, right? Businesses have just gotten more mobile. Talent has gotten more mobile. And so it's more important than ever for cities to up their game, to become places that attract talent. And this is particularly true of the UK. And the problem is that at this moment in which talent has become more mobile, we are facing pre-existing urban fissures, pre-existing urban problems, like the affordability crisis. The left-hand side just shows you the price relative to income in the UK. London's prices are astonishing and much higher than would be just justified by higher earnings. The right-hand side shows the relationship between high prices and how often new building projects are turned down. We have created an affordability crisis through our own policy decisions not to permit new housing. We also have a crisis in terms of upward mobility. Along the left-hand side, and this is just the US, you see the relationship between productivity and metropolitan area size or metropolitan area density, strong positive relationship. On the right-hand side, you show intergenerational mobility, your probability of a poor kid becoming a rich adult, that goes down with density. And so these are long festering issues that we need to resolve, but we need to resolve this in a way that actually makes sure that we continue to attract talent, that makes our cities hubs that attract people. I think going forward, right, we really do need to invest in health, and that's what David's going to talk about. But in terms of urban policy, I think we should expect cities to continue to change. I think we should expect urban businesses and urbanites to become younger. Commercial space is more vulnerable than residential. There's a lot of value of being able to repurpose commercial space for residential. And the fight for global talent has just gotten hotter, and this requires smarter government, fewer regulations that bind builders and new businesses, and the need to experiment and evaluate, the humility to learn. And I will now pass it over to my co-author.
Love hearing about it and love talking about it. I want to pick up on a couple of points that Ed raised, which is about the health response, what's been happening to pandemics and how it is that we will need to respond to them. And then we'll just open it up and we'll get lots of hopefully fun and enjoyable questions. So the first thing, and Ed sort of talked about it, but this really shows it in great detail, is potential pandemics are actually becoming more common in recent years. You know, we went a while from the plague of Athens to the Justinian plague to the Black Death and great influenza and so on, all were pretty far apart. And yet, if you think about recent periods of time, there have been actual or potential plagues probably every 2 or 3 years, pandemics every 2 or 3 years, from SARS and MERS and H1N1 and Ebola and a variety of Zika and related sorts of possibilities. Now, they haven't turned out to be as deadly as earlier plagues, thank goodness, although HIV/AIDS was extremely deadly on a world scale. But there's always the potential for outbreaks to become much more common. If I can go on to the next one. For pandemics to become more common. And let me, so let me just make sure if I do this. Yeah. So there are 3 lessons that we draw about dealing with plagues. You know, if we really want our cities to be vibrant, we're going to have to control the potential for outbreaks for pandemics, because if we don't, people will decide that it's not worth the health cost, as they for many centuries, many people decided that. So there are 3 lessons that we offer, and they're sort of a global lesson, a national lesson, and a local lesson. So globally, the comparison that we draw is between pandemic disease and nuclear war. So if you think about these two, they're both two of probably the 3 great global challenges of our day, the third one being climate change. We have, as a world, put a lot of effort into reducing the risk of nuclear war. We set up a whole structure in the West, NATO, which started with less than 10 countries, now is roughly 30 countries. It sort of focused on keeping the peace from the Soviet Union and preventing nuclear war around the globe. It was hugely successful. There was no nuclear war, even though many people predicted that it would happen after World War II. And yet we have done far, far less in terms of preventing global pandemic. It's not that we don't know what to do. So there have been any number of reports and so on that indicate what we need to do. We need to promote sanitary interventions, make sure the water is clean and the sewers are clean, regulate the interactions between humans and animals, spot and report diseases rapidly, isolate people who are positive, do all sorts of things like that. The difficulty is not in knowing what to do, it's in carrying it out. And the thing that strikes us here is that the infrastructure that the world set up for preventing global nuclear war is far more robust than is the infrastructure for the preventing pandemic disease. So NATO has a clear budgetary authority, a clear line of authority, a clear mission, a clear set of goals. The World Health Organization has a budget that is smaller than a big hospital in Massachusetts. That is, the entire World Health Organization is smaller than a medium or big hospital in Massachusetts. It begs for money from countries to do really great work, But as a result, since it gets money from China, when China says there's no pandemic here, the World Health Organization says there's no pandemic here. When West Africa has an Ebola outbreak, the WHO doesn't say anything because it's afraid that it'll hurt tourism to those countries. And so it's a sort of mix between needing to be certain about funding and not wanting to harm people in countries that are really low income. But the net effect is that when you mix politics with science, the science gets done poorly and you wind up with a greater risk of global pandemic than one needs. Nobody knows whether COVID could have been contained under another circumstance without resulting in a worldwide pandemic, but certainly the actions of the WHO were not optimal in that setting. So that's globally, we need an organization that we think looks more like NATO than like the World Health Organization. The second thing we've learned is at the national level, this is probably more true about the US than other countries, but it certainly applies to a lot of rich countries as well, which is that the healthcare system, our healthcare systems are not well equipped to address pandemic disease. The US spends more than any country on healthcare. We knew the healthcare system was sick. What we learned is that even $4 trillion is not enough to treat pandemic well. That is true across many different countries that they were sort of surprised at how poorly they did. And there are really a couple of reasons for this. The first is that in most countries, public health is separated from medical care. That's for historical reasons. Public health used to always be engineers and water and sanitation people, and medical care was doctors. But increasingly, that's not the case. Public health people now deal with what happens if there's a pandemic and how do you prevent the risk of opioid shared needles and HIV and opioid overdose deaths. And the doctors do the same thing. So the idea that we can keep public health and private health separate falls apart when so much of what happens with the public's health is related to what's happening in the private health. And it also happens because many countries, particularly the US, but also a number of European countries and other rich countries, have medical care systems that pay the bill but don't really control what's going on. Now, we are not certainly micromanagers in the sense that the federal or state government should directly control exactly what happens in the medical system. But on the other hand, having a system where the government really has very little say about whether it focuses on pandemic disease or treats people with very advanced diseases that will kill them, but treats them at enormous expense, taking that decision out of the public sphere seems like a very poor decision. So the net effect is that we have a system which was intentionally set up to make sure that government has relatively little say over it. And what happens is when we need government to have say over it, it doesn't work very well. The public health system hangs by a string. Put it another way, when the countries of the world needed to fight World War II, they didn't say, okay, we're paying more for tanks if anyone chooses to build them, and we're paying less for refrigerators for at home. They just said, no, we're going to turn this refrigerator plant into a tank plant, and this is what's going to happen. And because we need it to fight the war. And that sort of command economy, if you will, is absolutely vital when you've got an immediate mission that needs taken care of. So that's the sort of national level, which is going to involve more input, although in a smarter way, as Ed was talking about. The third point I will make is local, from the international to the national to the local. That is, we're used to thinking about healthy countries and sick countries, that is, countries where people live a long time and countries where people do not. Then we're used to thinking about healthy areas of countries and less healthy areas of countries. So London is a healthy area, and parts of the less well-off northern England are less healthy. But it turns out even that is not an accurate statement. Within any area, within any city, you have areas where people are long-lived, rich, and healthy, and areas where people are shorter-lived, poor, and less healthy. I've shown you New York and London. I could choose any set of cities around the world, and this would be true. In New York, you can take a roughly 20-minute subway ride, maybe 10 miles, and life expectancy would fall by close to 7 years. So that's roughly maybe a year of life expectancy for every mile that you travel, of life expectancy falling from, say, the east side of Manhattan out to Brownsville in the Bronx. In London, you can do the same thing. In fact, it's even worse. You can find areas where life expectancy is upwards of 90 years, and you can find areas right nearby where life expectancy is below 80 years. You just get on the tube, you go from one to the other. It's not that the environment differs so much. What we know is that the risk factors are enormously different. Smoking, obesity, unsafe sexual contact, sharing needles, all of those differ. All of those make some areas be healthier than other areas. not so much, although there's some about access to medical care, but much more about the conditions that people are in that lead them to be more or less exposed to disease. That becomes really problematic when, in the case of a pandemic, COVID spread through people who are obese were more susceptible to COVID, and then they would, of course, spread it to others. So obesity becomes a risk factor, not just for individual illness, but for the health of cities. In other situations, it might be smoking. Certainly, unsafe sexual contact spreads HIV, and sharing needles spreads HIV, as well as opioid overdose deaths. So all of those are examples where we're only as healthy as the least healthy people in society are. And that means that we're going to have to deal with the health and the health behaviors of everyone in society, not just think of those as kind of our own personal choice. One of the interesting things about health behaviors, and it comes back to what Ed said, which is that the best way we know of to change health behaviors is a little pill called education. I mean, it's not really a pill, but people are better educated to live longer and engage in healthier behaviors. And that seems to be causal to education. That is, when people have to stay in school longer, they wind up being healthier later on in life. So we need to think about health behaviors as not just in the realm of healthcare, but in the realm of social and education policy as well. I showed you the history of pandemics. You know, pandemic disease has been with us, unfortunately, as long as individuals have gathered together. And you can see the leading killers here. This is one picture that I think 50 years from now would be happy if it looked exactly the same as it does now. So we really don't want to add to this, although you can see HIV/AIDS where we have added to this. We would love it to be the case that we don't do that, but that's going to require work on our part to make sure that we don't do that. We've laid out some of that here, and we hope that those are things that can spark some more debate. So I'm going to stop here and just thank you so much for inviting us, and Vicky, it's just been a great pleasure.
Super. Well, thank you both, Ed and David, for that great intro. There's loads of things to get into. I think my favourite quote so far is about the baristas, the idea that they become a source of peril, not pleasure. But actually, these are the sort of, the challenges we've each been facing individually, but they have huge ramifications for how you manage cities, how you think about public health, how you change public perception more broadly. David, you just spoke a little bit about education. Do you want to say a bit more about sort of healthy cities and how education comes in alongside that? I'm conscious today, Welsh Government announced that schools in Wales will be postponed going back after the festive break. So children will be remote learning again for a little while to come. And we've seen during the pandemic in the UK, certainly, this real difference in how remote learning is taken on board, and indeed a huge increase in inequality. Probably we've undone 10 years, we think, of progress on education inequalities in the space of a year's worth of the pandemic. So say a bit more about education and healthy cities and how they sort of run in parallel.
So Vicky, you hit on all the relevant points here. So first thing is, if you choose any health behavior you want, whether it's smoking, drinking, obesity, going to the doctor for preventive care, taking your medications regularly, having a radon detector in your house, I don't care what it is, choose the measure of health behaviors, and the healthier, and people with more years of education are more likely to be on the healthier end of the scale. So that is like the one single constant of health behaviors that you can find, and it's true about everything. And as best we can tell, it is in some sense causal. That is, it's not just that some people are both wanting to go on in education and also wanting to make sure that they take their pills on a regular basis and that they get their cancer screening. It's that the longer people are told you must stay in school, the more they behave in those kinds of ways. And by the way, it's not that what you learn in school, there's not a smoker in the world, or at least in the rich world, who doesn't know that smoking is bad for you. And I've yet to meet the obese person who didn't understand that obesity was harming their health. So it's nothing at all about what you learn in school. It's something else about either who you're with or the social setting that you're in, and so on. So the education really matters. Unfortunately, we don't know what it is about the education. And this really comes to your point, which is, to what extent is, say, a year of Zooming equivalent to a year of in school? Or, what is it that, for students who don't want to go on to college, what is it that you could do? Certainly, we know some things like vocational education. Germany is the model of a sort of vocational education system, and Germany does extremely well in that. And every 10 years or so, the US decides it ought to copy Germany, and then we realize we're not actually German, so therefore it's difficult to copy the German system. As someone once said, would I like the Danish medical care system? Yes, if you give me the population of Denmark too. What we have learned, I believe, is that online education is not as good as in-person education. Like everything else that's technological, it's even less good for people who are lower on the scale. So people who don't have secure internet connections and stable places to use the internet at home and all of that find the online version to be even more difficult than the in-person version. That's not to say that it was a result of lack of effort, because every single teacher in the world made enormous efforts. Ed and I put in a lot of effort to make our classes be better online than they otherwise would have been, and that was only a fraction of what people did. And yet everyone could tell that it was not the same experience as being in person. So I think it's going to be critical that we figure out how to keep education be in person, unless we discover some way to do it remote, in person, because not just the sort of benefits to the individual being educated, but their lifetime incomes, their lifetime health, their lifetime participation and feelings in society are all incredibly dependent on that education experience.
Thank you. And you mentioned healthy behaviours, which is a big theme of our work at Nesta. We've been thinking about how we can consider particularly urban environments. And actually, the situation we're in at the moment is a rising obesity trend in the UK, but people making very rational decisions based on their food environment. If you walk out onto your high street and the only options are convenience food, or they're very calorific choices, or actually your school lunch menu has a set of choices, all of which are pretty unhealthy, or the cheapest food is also the most calorie dense, well, then you are making a very rational, very logical set of decisions that actually encourage you to eat unhealthily rather than healthily. And so really thinking about that structural environment of a city and how that can improve healthy behaviours is really important, right? I also want to pick up on housing. In fact, Shirley has asked a good question in the chat about how would housing and sort of, I guess, the types of housing, how we think about housing, how would that really aid healthy cities in the future? Ed, you're our sort of local government expert. Do you want to talk a bit more about housing in different contexts?
Absolutely. So there is over the past 50 years, 60 years in the US, longer in the UK, there has been, in some sense, a revolution in building rights, where, 100 years ago, when London rebuilt itself around the Tube, right, it was very easy to build larger blocks of flats. In the 1920s in New York City, they were building 100,000 new homes a year, right? Just an astounding amount of change. But over the past 50 years in the US, maybe 75 in the UK, we've had a revolution in which we basically allowed every neighbor to say no to every new project. We've created sort of a culture in which it is very difficult to build, and not for terrible reasons, right? I mean, there is an ideology that emphasizes the environment in the suburbs, and there is an ideology which emphasizes historic preservation in the city. But these actions are really not actually very good for the environment. Historic preservation is a different side, because when you don't allow building close to London, you just ensure that there's more building further and further away. You cause it to say, if you have a green belt, you cause it to skip the green belt and move to some even further away area, which just means more and more carbon emissions, longer and longer driving. Building densely is a way to create a more sustainable future. And it's also a way to promote inclusion, right? If you think about why people, haven't come to the most productive cities in the US, Silicon Valley, New York, or the most productive cities in Britain, London, right? A big reason is it is just too expensive to buy there. That is the fruit of just, of a construction decision that is locking poorer people out, locking middle-income people out from living in these cities. And hence creating these permanent pockets of pain in lower density parts of the world. Prior to COVID-19, I was convinced that America's largest unsolved social problem was the rise in prime-age male joblessness. But that isn't some uniform phenomenon. There are parts of America where more than 1 in 4 prime-age men are jobless, in part because it's just hard to imagine what less skilled people are going to do in low-density areas, whereas in cities, there are opportunities in the great urban service sectors, the 32 million Americans who worked in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade prior to 2020. Those opportunities will hopefully come back, and that just makes it all the more important to enable building. Now, that's really hard in a city like London, which does, in fact, have many, many beautiful places. But I think the crucial element is in areas where you can allow building, particularly brownfield sites, build big. Go up, because in fact, going up in areas which are not historically relevant is the way to make sure you aren't going to disturb areas that are historically relevant, and you're not going to encroach on the environment. One other point about health. One of the other reasons to emphasize density, apart from the environmental benefits, are also the health benefits, right? That in fact, living in a walking environment is just a great way to make sure, when the fastest way to get to your job is by walking, you're going to have a lot more people who are actually getting some exercise in their day. So,
absolutely. In fact, Nesta's people-powered results team been working with colleagues in Scotland on 20-minute neighbourhoods. The idea that you ought to be able to get to everything within a 20-minute walk, so that your job and your leisure and your retail, but also your kids' school and where you go to the supermarket, ought all to be available. And actually, that could empower a great number of people to live a sort of healthier.
Vicky, just to pick up on that theme for 1 second, firms are incredibly good at thinking about ways to get you to try their product, make it crunchier or tastier or more fat or whatever. And so governments need to be thinking about always new ways to try to get people to behave in better ways. And there's no sense in which either of those are static things. And progress, of course, can be good on all things. That is, cheaper food is good for us because we don't have to spend our money on there. And at the same time, public sector innovations that say, here's an easier way for you to get your exercise and to maintain other healthier behaviors. That's not kind of nannying you, but that is really helping you to live a better life that you want to live, can be extremely valuable too. So government innovation has got to be a critical part of this.
Definitely. Well, a theme for government innovation, I should say thank you for all of your questions so far. If you still have more questions, type them in the comments box and we'll make sure we get to them. So on the theme of government innovation, let's talk about the climate emergency. Clearly, cities have a role to play, whether that's thinking about how buildings are constructed, how industry operates, or whether it's about the basics of food and water. Tell us more about how governments can really think about resolving the climate emergency through how they plan and maintain their cities.
So on the mitigation side, the reduction of carbon emissions, it's clear that cities are part of the solution. If you think about the great growing economies of India and China, and you see their per capita emissions rise to that seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by over 130%. If they stop at the level seen in wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%, right? So we all have a lot to gain by, embracing, at least giving cities the freedom to build up. That's coming from two things. That's coming from driving much shorter distances, and it's coming from generally living in smaller dwelling units. So, and you really see this in the U.S. that the places that look brown are green, the places that look green are brown, because of this, just the fact that you have shorter drives and less room to heat or to cool, and that's particularly valuable in places that are tough climatically. Right. So the more that you have hotter and hotter summers, and of course, this is a feed loop that works in a bad way, right? The more that you're going to have more demand for air conditioning, which causes more carbon. So there's a lot to be gained by building densely. The harder issue is on the adaptation issue. How do we protect our cities from climate-related disaster? Now, I was on an advisory panel for something for Thames Vision relating to, and I feel reasonably, confident that the UK, which has been, thinking about flooding in London for a very long time, will actually be on top of this. Certainly more so than the US, but much more so than the cities of the developing world. And if I think about where I am most worried about climate change leading to large-scale deaths, there are two populations in the developing world. First of all, it's subsistence farmers in difficult climate zones, right? For them, often the best answer economically is to get them into cities where they can be part of a linked global economy. And so even if their farmland becomes unusable, they can still figure out some way to eat. But then it's the cities that are low-lying, vulnerable to water, and that's an area in which, you know, there really is a humanitarian crisis that we need to have, you know, the engineers of today, the engineers of the future, trying to figure out how to protect these places against flood and other climate-related natural disasters.
Sorry, lost my unmute button for a second there. Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, you've answered another one of our questions that was submitted beforehand from Richie at the University of Edinburgh, who was asking, from Umar from ComSat, who was asking how the futures of developing country cities are linked to those futures of developed countries and their cities. But anything more you want to say on this theme? You know, how does this sort of inherently global perspective on cities affect different places differently?
Absolutely. I mean, they're tightly. I mean, they're linked through climate change, right? So our emissions beset them. Their emissions beset us. We are linked through diseases. A disease that starts in the developing world can spread anywhere. I think what that means, at least for me, is that we have to recognize that we are one species, right? And that we need to make sure that we care about the cities of the developing world and that we invest in them. We take that seriously, because, you know, we've got to, you know, if only for purely selfish reasons, if only for trying to protect ourselves from climate change and protect ourselves from new pandemic. So I hope that we emerge from COVID-19 with more of a dedication to, you know, thinking about all of our planet, thinking about the ties that bind us, and remembering that the vocation, the calling to help make the cities of the developing world more livable is really one of the highest and most important vocations of the 21st century.
Now, there's a question here for colleagues who are zooming in from the US to talk to you, which is about zoning, which is not really a thing that exists in the UK in quite the same way in urban planning, but talking about sort of zoning changes in the built environment, and whether or not there's academic work or any literature that talks about path dependence. I don't know if, David, do you want to talk to this?
Let me get Ed to start off.
This is well, there's a lot of academic work on zoning. I mean, I've been working on this topic for 20 odd years. So you know, I can go to Google Scholar and type in zoning Glaeser, and, you know, a bunch of papers will come up on how, you know, powerful zoning is. In the UK, it's things like the Town and Country Planning Act, which have, you know, similar power to shape the way that we build. I'm going to particularly follow the path dependence, and obviously there's a lot of path dependence, right? One of the reasons why our cities look the way that they did is that housing is durable, and a city that is built during an industrial heyday, whether it's Detroit in the U.S. or Glasgow in the UK, those cities remain large even when the factory jobs disappear. And that can often create something of a hangover, if you will, of sort of having, you know, almost too much housing to actually match with the local economy.
Yeah, we've definitely got that challenge for sure in some of our urban areas, particularly in the centre of the UK, where heavy industry previously, say whether that was coal mining or just manufacturing, and since has disbanded, and we're left with lots of cheap housing stock and places people really want to live because they are beautiful, but with a lack of jobs of the future that will sustain sort of prosperous living in those locations. Ryan,
just to go back, Vicky, can I just go back to the zoning and stuff for 1 second? Because what used to happen a lot is people would leave those areas and they would move to bigger, denser cities. And unfortunately, in the US, many of those bigger, denser cities have made it virtually impossible to afford housing there. You know, so you have someone who's in, you know, Cleveland or Detroit, and, you know, the city is not doing super great. So they say, okay, you know, maybe I ought to move. But you can't move to Silicon Valley unless you have millions of dollars, and you can't move to Los Angeles, and you can't move to New York, and you can't move to Boston and Chicago. You can't. So people do move. They move to Louisville and Nashville and, you know, Austin, Texas, and so on, Houston, where you can build housing, but the geographic mobility is constrained. So in that sense, the zoning restrictions that maybe even far away really constrain what people everywhere, how they live their lives everywhere.
And that is definitely true. You're right. The sort of sense of the UK green belt or not, but also of the types of brownfield development that is permitted within cities. We're still very, very slow to permit use of brownfield sites. David, do you want to say a little bit to Ryan's question? This was submitted in advance. So Ryan from Basingstoke works in local government, thinking about the high streets. Now, again, a slight difference UK-US here. The high street tends to be the hub of our towns and cities. A little bit in cities we've seen out of town retail centres, but we don't have those sort of strip malls to the same extent as we do in the US. But in the UK, thinking about the pandemic, obviously we've seen a lot of small retailers go under. We've seen some pretty big retailers go under as well. But the high street sort of hollowed out almost, empty shop fronts, fewer people travelling in during a health crisis. Do you think the high street will weather the storm, David?
So it's a great question. One of the things, and Ed was talking about it some, a few decades ago, most of what the economy produced was what you might think of as essentials. I mean, not absolutely essential, but a new icebox or a new refrigerator or something. When your old one breaks, you kind of got to get a new one. So you're not going to live without it. And increasingly what the economy provides are services that are discretionary. So for example, do I make my coffee at home, or do I go to the Starbucks and get the coffee, or do I go to the local coffee shop and get the coffee? And I prefer without risk of disease, I prefer going out to the coffee shop to get the coffee. But if you throw in the risk of disease, I don't prefer that, and I prefer to do it at home. And so this is really the first major pandemic where we saw service employment incredibly fall because people decided they didn't want to engage in the luxury part of the service economy. And so you see people not going out to dinners and not going out to movie theaters. And even things that you didn't know were so discretionary turned out to be very discretionary, like business travel. The number of times you would go, here that we would go to Washington, D.C., or that people would go to London for something having to do with the public sector or something like that. Well, maybe I don't have to do that. Maybe I can Zoom, and maybe I can skip the trip entirely. So that turned out to be discretionary. Ironically, in the United States, medical care turned out to be discretionary. So going into the doctor's office, doctor's visits fell by 2/3 at the height of the pandemic last April and May. They came back in the sense that they're within 10% of where they were, but we never made up all the missed visits. So there was just like this whole missed visits that nobody seems in a great hurry to make up. And they're not going to be doing it soon because of fears of pandemic stuff again. So I think a lot of what we've learned is that the economy is more of a luxury goods economy than we thought, both in terms of the sort of things we always knew were luxuries and the things that we didn't know were luxuries that we turn out to feel we can do without if need be. That's going to put just this huge premium on being able to control pandemic disease. Because otherwise, what reason is there to invest in a string of coffee shops on High Street in, major British cities if you think every 2 years are going to be shut down for 3 months, or every 5 years are going to be shut down for half a year, or whatever it is? We see the same thing in the US. We see retail stores that are, still blank. The other thing we see, incidentally, and I'm curious to see if you see it in the UK as well, is stores that are reopening, want to reopen, but they can't get workers. And the workers are saying, this job was so poor and the wages were what they were. And I discovered during pandemic, I didn't need this job. Maybe I have some savings. Maybe I want a different job, something like that. So many of them, the service quality or the hours have declined because they can't hire the workers that they want to hire. So between no customers or I've got the customers, but I can't get the workers, we see just this big hollowing out of things. I'm curious if you see that latter part in the UK. But it's absolutely something that if we don't get a handle on pandemic disease and we don't make the jobs be better, we're going to wind up in that situation for quite a while.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we saw over the summer, actually, when we sort of first emerged from what we call lockdown 2 or 3 in the UK, people wanting to go on holiday, wanting to go and spend time in other locations. And exactly as you say, couldn't get the retail workers, couldn't get the service workers in hospitality to be able to fulfill that demand. And that is continuing into the Christmas season as retailers struggle to recruit staff on minimum wage with 0-hour contracts. And staff are simply saying, actually, this isn't how I want to live my life. I want either, you know, more secure contracts or better pay if you're going to encourage me to do this. Otherwise, I'm going to stay home and take care of my kids, or I'm going to go and join a different type of business altogether that treats people differently. Absolutely. Now, say a little bit more about the pandemic and what's coming. If you look into your crystal balls, obviously pretty difficult to predict, but we talked about how pandemics in the past have shaped cities. But to what extent do you think we've already seen that shaping take place? To what extent is there still more to come with this current COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I want to just mention one of the things that's sort of really crucial in terms of the high streets story is that, remember, we'd already been evolving for the past 15 years from shops that sell goods to shops that sell experiences, because of e-commerce disrupting high streets. And so this is another example where this, you know, wave has come down and hit places that are, you know, hit an industry that was already in turmoil. I think looking forward, it's very hard to know how long this plague is going to be with us. I mean, it's sort of amazing that we've gone 2 years on this, and I have zero predictions whatsoever in terms of what's going to happen to Omicron or whatever future variants there are. I will say going forward that I continue to be optimistic about the future of cities, and I continue to be optimistic about the ability of people to come together in urban spaces and to do absolutely amazing things. I mean, I started my discussion with Athens, where, you know, miraculous things happened when Plato and Socrates argued on an Athenian street corner, right? And amazing things are still happening in cities throughout the world, from Karachi to Kinshasa to Birmingham. And I believe very strongly that the age of urban miracles is not over, but we do need to make sure that we have a health system and a public sector that is actually, you know, really working harder to protect our cities from the demons that come with density.
Agreed. And David, are you equally optimistic?
I am optimistic. You know what? So I'll be pessimistic for a second, then I'll be optimistic. So the pessimism is that I think in many ways we were lucky that COVID was not even worse than it was. So COVID spread pretty rapidly, but it was not particularly deadly. If you compare it with SARS or MERS or certainly HIV/AIDS, which is near 100% fatal untreated, we got very lucky. I think counting on luck is not a great strategy in life. And I do think that we know many things about what to do. And, you know, to terribly abuse a phrase, a cliche in the US, I think the arc of progress, the arc of actions bends towards progress. And so countries that did poorly in SARS and MERS are doing better now. Hopefully countries that did poorly in COVID, of which we are one in the US, and probably the UK gets to be in that same bucket, will learn and do better next time. So that's my hope, is that we will learn to do better, because we can't count on being this lucky.
Agreed. Well, that is probably a good space in which to end, as time is coming to a close. But thank you, Ed and David, both for sharing some of the insights from your long academic history, but also for talking to us about some of the things that are going on today, and some of the situations. That's genuinely been fascinating. I've got about 70 more questions I want to ask. But if you want to read more at home, then their book, Survival of the City, is available now from all good retailers. And if you would like to join Nesta in talking more about healthy cities, about healthy eating, about environments which foster both an increase in prosperity but also in well-being, then we would love to stay in touch with you. Do sign up for Nesta's newsletter or join us for more Nesta Talks 2 events in the future. Ed and David, thank you so much for sharing and for your optimism about the future. We'll definitely take that with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you, Vicky.